hard to get to work.
Folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here, and how's the conference been so far? Good. Well, we are very excited to have with us our next speaker, and I'm particularly excited because I recently started going to law school, and I've started reading some of Chris's dad's opinions in my case books. So it's interesting to have the name in the books and in real life here. So Christopher Scalia he's the eighth of Justice Scalia's 9 children, and he's a former professor of English. He works at a public relations firm in Washington, D.C., and speaks and writes often and everywhere. And I think he's also a fellow at the Federalist Society, right? No? Okay.
No, I just spoke at one of those.
You just spoke at one of them. Okay. Anyways, he lives in Virginia with his wife and 3 children, and we're very happy to have him here today. Please give Chris a warm welcome.
Thank you. Is the microphone on? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Alexander, for the introduction and for inviting me. And thank you all for coming to listen to me today. It's great to be here. I've enjoyed the conference so far. It seems like a wonderful thing you guys are doing here. I am not under the delusion that you really want to hear much of what I have to say. You'd rather hear a lot about what my dad has to say. I know that. So I will talk a little bit about the book I helped edit. It's a collection of my father's speeches on sale. I'm happy to sign them afterwards. By the way, if you have one, I'm going to be signing them right there after my talk. This collection, Scalia Speaks, is kind of a greatest hits collection of my father's speeches. He spoke, I'm assuming you, by the way, know who my father was, but just in case you straggle into the wrong room. My father was Antonin Scalia. He was on the Supreme Court from 1986 until 2016, so just about 30 years. And he spoke a lot. He spoke around the country and around the world, talking to people about a lot of things. Primarily, he spoke about his approach to interpreting the law and the Constitution. But that's not all he talked about. And when I started work on this project with one of his former clerks, Ed Whalen, who writes a lot for National Review and is president of the Ethics and Public Policy Council up in D.C., we knew that this book would include a lot of speeches about the law, and it does. We were surprised, though, by just how many other things he discussed, and really how often he talked about non-Supreme Court related topics. So to give you some idea, as we were working on the collection, we stumbled across a speech he delivered at the National Wild Turkey Hunting Federation in Tennessee. Which, I mean, what sitting Supreme Court justice doesn't speak at that event? He actually spoke there twice, and it's one of the more surprising, but also one of my favorite speeches in the collection, because you see a side of him that might be a little bit surprising. Alexander says that he's reading some of my dad's opinions, and he's known for his opinions, his sharp writing, his clear writing, his scathing dissents, as people always said. And I understand that a lot of people, law students, go straight to his opinions. And when he was still on the court, that's the one, when a decision was rendered by the court, people went to his opinion first, if he had one, even if he was in a minority, just because it was the most fun to read. But they were still legal opinions, so they were necessarily legal and kind of burdened with certain conventions of that form. They had a lot of footnotes, references to other cases that unless you were a real student of the law, you may not know what was going on there. In his speeches, he didn't have to he didn't have to do that. He could be a lot more casual, a lot more personable, a lot funnier. And I think that's one of the things that comes through in this collection, especially in speeches like the one he delivered to the Wild Turkey Hunting Federation. But even then, he talks about the law a little bit there. He talks about the Second Amendment briefly in that speech, you might imagine. There's another speech he delivered about his childhood growing up in Queens and the games and sports he played growing up there. That's a great speech too, because it just seems like a black and white movie where my dad's played by Pacino or De Niro or something. And then, so that we were really struck by the variety of speeches, and we wanted this to be a collection that would be accessible to and enjoyed by non-legal specialists. So people who admired my dad but didn't go to law school and just kind of followed the court from a distance. That's the kind of person we had in mind, as well as legal scholars. So if you are a Supreme Court geek and follow every opinion very closely, you will still like this book too. That was our goal there. So that's the book very briefly and very generally. I should say I think there are 48 speeches total, and there's one section devoted to speeches that are just about the law, and those are 12 speeches. So the rest touch on a lot of other things. He gave commencement addresses. He spoke to religious organizations. He took his speeches about religion very seriously. He spoke at commencement addresses, or delivered commencement addresses. And there's a really moving speech there about the Holocaust. He spoke at a Holocaust remembrance event in the late 90s. So things like that. It's really, we were impressed by just the number of topics he covered and the strength of the speeches, no matter what the topic was. But what I want to do is talk to you about these speeches specifically as they relate to what I understand is the theme of the conference, which is breaking down barriers to freedom. So I want to talk about what my father has to say about, or ideas you can get about that topic from this collection. So I will be quoting somewhat liberally from his collection. My dad wouldn't want a lot of things done liberally, but I think quoting is probably okay. Thank you. If you use that one later, just give me credit. Okay? And I want to talk about two things in particular. I want to talk about what my father had to say about the separation of powers, and I want to then talk about what he had to say about knowledge and character. Because I think understanding what he had to say about these things, we get a good sense of, I think, how to defend or maybe even revive specifically American concepts of freedom. Not just concepts of freedom, but actual freedom. So first, the separation of powers. My father liked to quote, especially in the 80s, a Bill of Rights. He liked to contrast our Bill of Rights with the Bill of Rights of another country. And he would read our First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that's part of the First Amendment, as you know. And then he would read this from this other Bill of Rights. Citizens are guaranteed freedom of conscience, that is, the right to profess or not to profess any religion and to conduct religious worship or atheistic propaganda. Incitement of hostility or hatred on religious grounds is prohibited. It almost sounds like the Major League Baseball disclaimer. And then this is our Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This other Bill of Rights, though, said, citizens are guaranteed freedom of speech, of the press, and of assembly, meetings, street processions, and demonstrations. Our Constitution didn't mention street processions or demonstrations. Citizens have the right to associate in public organizations that promote their political activity and initiative. And then this Bill of Rights mentions punishments for people who try to prevent that. Prosecution for criticism, prosecution for criticism is prohibited. Persons guilty of such persecution shall be called to account. This is a much better Bill of Rights. It seems like a better country. But it was actually the Soviet Union. This Bill of Rights meant nothing. It was a much more generous Bill of Rights, but none of these rights were guaranteed, because as great as our Bill of Rights was, it would have been nothing, as my dad liked to say, just an empty parchment, if it weren't supported by the Constitution that came before it, the articles, the original articles. That much less, we don't celebrate that as much less glamorous. But my father often insisted the Bill of Rights would be nothing without that. The Soviet Union didn't have a proper constitution, so its Bill of Rights meant nothing. He says, the Bill of Rights is what we celebrate, but it would be nothing without the stability provided by the Constitution's original articles and institutional frameworks. And on page 163, he says, so while it is entirely appropriate for us Americans to celebrate our wonderful Bill of Rights, we realize, or should realize, that it represents the fruit and not the roots of our constitutional tree. And that was a lot of what that's a kind of a key component of his understanding of our freedoms. Our freedoms don't mean a whole lot without the framework established by the original articles. And his judicial philosophy was also really, in large part, about maintaining the separation of powers. This is a collection of speeches, so it's not a novel, so there's no real villain. But if there were a villain, it would be what's called the living Constitution. And the living Constitution is the approach to constitutional interpretation by which the Constitution evolves according to the norms and standards of the times. And my father did not like this, and he spent his career explaining why that was a dangerous approach. That was bad for the separation of powers and bad for democracy. His concern was that basically the living Constitution gave judges authority and power over that were rightfully delegated to the legislative branch. It's not for judges to determine what the standards and norms of the time are. We have Congress for that. We have chief executive for that. Judges interpret the law. And when they do more than that, they are essentially usurping power from the people. In other words, put another way, they are undermining the separation of powers. My father liked to describe or compare this to a tomato sauce commercial from the 1980s. I'm guessing not many of you guys remember this one, but I do vividly. Prego tomato sauce used to have commercials where somebody was heating up tomato sauce, and his husband comes up as my father tells the story and says, "What? You're not making homemade sauce?" "Yeah, I'm making Prego. It's fine. Don't worry about it." "Oh, but what about the garlic?" "It's in there." "What about the onions?" "It's in there." "What about the fresh basil?" "It's in there." And my father would say, "We've got that kind of a constitution now. You want a right to an abortion? It's in there. You want a right to die? It's in there. Whatever is good, whatever is true, what is beautiful, it's in there. It doesn't matter what the Constitution actually says, because if we're following the living Constitution approach, we just project what we want into the Constitution." And that gives judges way too much power. It is not their job to interpret the evolving standards of our society. That's for the other branches to do. My father used to also point out that the belief that one of the main advantages of the living Constitution that people like to praise was that it was more flexible. It gave us more flexibility. My father's approach, which I'll get into in a second, is too restrictive. If judges can kind of check the temperature of the culture, then they can be more flexible. And my father would say, actually, it's less flexible. It takes flexibility away. Roe v. Wade is a great example. There's no flexibility in Roe v. Wade. Anything a state tries to do to restrict abortion, it goes to the federal courts and very often is struck down because it somehow manages to violate Roe v. Wade. So there is no flexibility with abortion law. Well, you could say, well, okay, maybe flexibility is not the right word, but it gives us more rights. The living Constitution grants more rights. And again, that's not necessarily true. Living Constitution can take rights away just as easily as it can confer them. If you want to see the living Constitution is granting us the right to abortion, okay, but what's to stop the living Constitution approach from taking away Second Amendment rights or rights protecting people in search and seizure and things like that? It's not more flexible, and it doesn't necessarily confer rights. My father, on the other hand, was what he called an originalist when it came to interpreting the Constitution, and a textualist when it came to interpreting other laws. And originalism means you interpret the Constitution according to its original public meaning, not its original intent, its original public meaning. What did it mean to the people who ratified it? And so that's different from original intent. There's a speech in a collection that explains the difference. And it's different from strict constructionism. A lot of people use these terms interchangeably, but they're different. And when we talk about originalism and when we talk about conservative justices, we're really talking about original public meaning. Original public meaning, my father argued, and he was right as it turns out, coincidentally, is limits the power of a judge. And it makes it harder for a judge to render an opinion because the opinion reaches policy ends that judge likes. My father often gave the example of a flag burning case where he was the deciding vote in ruling that flag burning was protected by the First Amendment. My father thought flag burning was a terrible thing, but as he liked to say, just because something is dumb or stupid doesn't make it unconstitutional. He said he wanted a stamp that said, dumb but constitutional. And somebody eventually sent him that stamp. So a law can be a stupid law, but it may still be constitutional. On the other hand, a law may reach a policy end that we love and still be unconstitutional. And originalism restrains judges in that regard. He uses a flag burning case often, but there were other instances, for example, search and seizure cases where my father's decisions were really liberal. That is, they supported or reinforced left-wing policy preferences, or what we often consider left-wing policy preferences, because that's what matched the original public meaning of the Constitution. The same is true in a lot of cases involving rights of defendants to face their accusers. So that's, just to recap so far, I've touched on separation of powers involving our Bill of Rights as opposed to the original articles. I talked also about originalism versus the living Constitution. And let me wrap up this section by talking about how, while with the living Constitution, the Supreme Court has usurped power that rightfully belonged to other branches too often, my father argued, let the other branches take their power away. He delivered a speech to Congress that we included in this collection, I think in 2012. He delivered a speech, basically, he wasn't afraid to challenge his audiences, and he admonished Congress by saying, too often, Congress and the President shrug and say, I'm not really sure this is constitutional. I think maybe this law isn't really constitutional, but who am I to judge? I can let the Supreme Court sort it out. They're in charge of that sort of thing. Well, who are they to judge? They were people who took an oath to swearing to defend and protect the Constitution. So they should do that, and they should pass laws, propose laws, and sign laws that are in accordance with the Constitution. My father was worried that the Supreme Court, we had an unhealthy attitude to the Supreme Court where only the court's opinion about the Constitution mattered. And that was just one case, one instance of that. He said, This is from one of the speeches in the collection. A Supreme Court fiercely dedicated to preserving that document, the Constitution, cannot exist in the midst of a society that does not understand it. The court is at best a safety net. The first and ultimately the most influential interpreters of the document are the people's elected representatives, who in turn reflect the understanding of the people. The court can stand against the distortion of original understanding produced by the temporary excess of one brief era, the era of McCarthyism, for example. But in the nature of things, the court cannot stand against a departure from our traditional attitudes that is deep and sustained. The reason is quite simple. The justices of the court are not dispatched from Mars, but are drawn from the same society that shares those new understandings. So if the understanding persists long enough among the people, it will prevail. That's, by the way, one of the reasons my father spoke as often as he did. He wanted to make sure as many people as possible, not just court watchers, understood the Constitution and the role of the courts. All right, I want to talk now about knowledge and character as kind of a bulwark to American freedom, and this is something my father talked a lot about. As I said, he talked to students very often, high school students. He spoke at my high school graduation. He spoke at a lot of college commencements as well. And a point he repeated often in those contexts was that a free people needed to know certain things and needed to have certain things. So first he would talk about a civic education, which he describes the education of the citizenry to render it capable of democratic self-governance. In other words, what you need to know to be a good citizen in a democracy. And one of the things you needed to know was how your government was supposed to work. And that goes back to the point I was just making about knowledge of the Constitution. If you read a lot of surveys over the last 20 years, really, it's pretty scary about how little people know about our rights. Recent surveys about First Amendment, for example, most people think that the First Amendment does not protect hate speech, but it does. Things along those lines. Again, that doesn't mean hate speech is good, but it's protected. And he often expressed amazement that when he spoke to law students at the best law schools in the country, very few of them would have read the Federalist Papers. So he told them, read the Federalist Papers. And when he spoke to members of the House a few years ago, he said, read the Federalist Papers. Have a copy on your desk. Know what they were up to and what they were trying to do. And he would often talk about and refer to what the founders wanted from civic education. He pointed to Noah Webster and Benjamin Rush in particular in their writings, and point out that they believed in what he called, quote, nothing short of indoctrination in Republican principles. Indoctrination makes it sound bad, but that's what a civics education in elementary school or middle school is about. We need to have citizens who know what the different branches of government are, for example, what the distinct roles are, so that they know what they're doing when they vote, if they're voting at 16, or if that happens, or however old they are when they vote. So my father talked about what people needed to know, what they needed to learn, but he also talked about what they needed to have, and things apart from knowledge. And specifically, he spoke a lot about character and virtue. He liked to quote Cardinal Newman, who wrote, "Knowledge is one thing, virtue is another." Let me read the longer quotation here. "Good sense is not conscience. Refinement is not humility, nor is largeness and justness of view faith. Philosophy, however enlightened, however profound, gives no command over the passions, no influential motives, no vivifying principles." And his favorite founder was George Washington. And he would always point out, George Washington was not the smartest of the bunch. A lot of the other founders were smarter than him, Jefferson and Hamilton. He was, among his peers, he was pretty poorly educated. Why did everybody admire him? Why was he the easy pick to be our first president? And my father concluded that it had to have been his character. but one thing, only he would shirk the power that was offered him. Only he would step down after 2 terms and keep it limited. And my father quoted Washington a lot. He was a great admirer of him for that reason, among others. But then he would also quote his own father, my grandfather. My father's dad was a professor of Romantic languages. He was an immigrant from Sicily, and he was a very smart guy. He translated letters that an Italian wrote to Thomas Jefferson. So he knew a lot about the founding, but he was a sharp guy too. But my father was always impressed that as much importance as his father put on knowledge and education, he would also say, that is, my grandfather would tell my dad, the brain is like any other muscle. It can be hired by the hour. Only character is not for sale. Again, this is a very well-educated person who did not diminish the significance of education. He was a college professor, and he pushed my dad to work pretty hard through school. But that's what he had to say about knowledge as opposed to character. Part of character, my father believed, and crucial in forming character and virtue, was religion. This was not an original argument by my father, as he pointed out. This is something all the founders believed. We've kind of inherited this notion that the founders were deists, and many of them were. But even then, they knew that for many people, for virtue to be formed, you need a religious base, some baseline of religion. Not for everybody, but for most people. They relied on religion. So there needed to be room for religion in the public sphere. As my dad put it, the founders stressed that a civic education required the teaching of religious values. So in other words, a civic education wasn't just knowing about the branches of government. For the founders, civic education also involved some religious education or religious understanding. He delivered a speech that we included in this collection for sale. That he delivered in Cherry Point, North Carolina. There's a Marine Corps air station there, I guess, but it's like 2.5, 3 hours away from here. And he delivered a speech there. The person who invited him was amazed that my dad accepted the invitation, but my dad was happy to deliver this speech. And that speech is all about how the Supreme Court was doing serious damage to the American tradition of one nation under God. And that my father believed that was a foundational principle of America. And he would quote George Washington and others to establish that fact. This is how he put it. I want to speak this morning about one of our oldest and I think most important national traditions that has for some years been in grave and imminent peril. The traditional belief expressed unashamedly in our national pronouncements and reflected faithfully in our public policies that we are a nation under God. And he was concerned that because basically since the 1960s, even as late as the 1950s, the Supreme Court confirmed that we are a nation under God. That's kind of a foundational principle. But with the expansion of the living Constitution approach, that belief was kind of withering away. That protection was withering away. And my father was concerned by what he called, quote, the view that the government must be scrupulously impartial, not merely as between various religious sects and denominations, but as between religion in general and atheism. So in other words, and he wrote about this in many court cases, for example, involving the display of 10 commandments in public places, that was not unconstitutional according to his opinions, because looking at the original public meaning of the Constitution, that was allowed. They did things like that then. So when they talked about the establishment of religion, they wouldn't have thought that saying one nation under God or something like that in a speech was that sort of thing. But you have a lot of organizations now that are fighting to make things like that unconstitutional. Now, we could decide that it's bad to do that sort of thing, and that maybe it's insensitive to have a nativity scene outside the town hall. Okay, but it's still constitutional, my father would argue. Again, just because something is a bad idea doesn't mean it's unconstitutional. And to be clear, I don't think my father would have said that was a bad idea. I want to close with what my father said in a commencement address. He asked the question, why do we believe America is the greatest country in the world? And he would walk through some reasons. Well, is it because it's the most beautiful? Well, there are a lot of beautiful things here, but pound for pound, a place like Switzerland is probably more beautiful. So it can't be that. He walked through various things. And he concluded, we are the greatest because of the good qualities of our people and because of a governmental system that gives room for those qualities to develop. Not only is it not true that we are the greatest because we are the freest, but rather quite the opposite is true. We are the freest because we have those qualities that make us the greatest. For freedom is a luxury that can be afforded only by the good society. When civic virtue diminishes, freedom will inevitably diminish as well. Thanks. I think there's plenty of time. I talked a lot longer than I told Alexander I would. I'm sorry about that, but it was mostly my dad's ideas, so I didn't really say anything original there.
I think if you'd like to just call on.
Sure. I saw you in the back first.
So, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So, I'm curious, and I'm sure that I will get the answer when I read the book, but if I can hear from you, I heard you talk about how your father went to the origination of the Constitution. I'm curious as to how he spoke to the common theme that we hear now, that, it's an antiquated document, or times have changed since then. So how did he reconcile that? How did he respond to that?
He didn't think the Constitution was infallible. I've heard that. I read that recently in the description of originalism. Originalists believe the Constitution is infallible. No, not at all. And as he pointed out, we fought wars because of inherent problems with the Constitution. Well, we fought a war over that. He would point out that there is a system by which to change the Constitution, and we used to understand that. That's how we got women's suffrage, by fighting for those rights. Justices didn't determine that it was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. The people fought for it, got an amendment. So the Constitution has in it a system by which it can be changed. But it's something the people need to do. It should not be left up to unelected judges. And he pointed out, everybody hates the confirmation battles we go through now, where question after question is, well, how would you vote on Roe v. Wade? Do you want to overturn it? Or what do you think about Citizens United? And then the nominee hems and haws because he or she can't really answer that question. My father pointed out, every confirmation hearing, not just the Supreme Court now, but every federal court becomes a mini referendum because judges have enormous power they're not supposed to have. And senators recognize that now. So as long as justices and judges are seizing power that senators should have and congressmen should have, they're going to put them through the ringer, and their voters will expect them to. So when we get away from the system that's supposed to be in place, we get all of these other kind of trickle-down problems. Yes?
Thank you for being here. Popular press portrayed your father and Justice Ginsburg as being famously friends or quite close. Without concern for your own untimely departure, would you be willing to comment on each of the other justices, either your own personal interactions with them or his interaction with, the Supreme Court,
Yeah.
we don't get a lot of behind the curtain
Yeah,
exposure to.
Well, let's see.
Thank
I should save a lot of that for my memoir. I could say his friendship with Justice Ginsburg was not fake news, that they had a very good friendship, and it was not just the two of them. I'm dodging the question by just talking about Ginsburg. She wrote a foreword for this collection, and there's a speech, a roast my father delivered for her. They were first on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals together in the early 80s. My father went to the Supreme Court. While she was still on the lower court, he delivered a roast for her. And it's a beautiful, and her forward, they're both beautiful kind of testimonies of their working relationship and their friendship. And in that roast, he makes fun of her a little bit, but also told her basically how much he missed working with her, what a great colleague she was, not knowing that she would be on the court with him a couple years later. And their spouses were friends too. My mom was very close with Justice Ginsburg, is close with Justice Ginsburg and her deceased spouse, Marty Ginsburg. They had a lot in common, and despite all the many differences they had, they focused on the things they shared. Love of opera. I think their New York backgrounds helped things a little bit too. Both pretty funny. But more generally speaking, I'm not going to talk about relationships with individual justices, but the court is a family. Obviously, there are disagreements, and there are sharp disagreements, but I saw it most vividly after my father died. Just the support the other justices gave him, and gave my mom and my family was enormous and very moving. Justice Stevens came. I guess he came, and he no longer on the court, but he was there. I think Justice Souter. My dad was very close to Justice Souter. So there were friendships that you wouldn't expect. They're different than politicians. Politicians have to, kind of pretend at least like they hate people on the other side of the aisle. Justices don't have to do that. Sorry. You back there, sir?
Steve?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Do you know if your father had a favorite opera?
I'm sure he did. I don't know what it was. I did not inherit his love of opera. He got me into classical music a little bit, but opera was a bridge too far. Sorry. I'm sure somebody knows that, but I don't. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Who was your dad's mentor?
My dad's mentor. Whoa. Apart from me. Well, I can tell you some of the formative experiences he had. I don't know about individual mentors. He had a lot of great colleagues, like a lot of kind of obscure people who helped him along the way. But his high school education at Xavier High School in New York City was very particularly formative. It was a Catholic military school, and this collection includes a great speech about that and how formative it was. He went to Georgetown for undergraduate, and he mentions, I don't remember the professor's name, but there is a mentor there who asked him a very tough question that my dad thought was a softball question. He asked him, this is basically his exit exam, said, Antonin, what was I just called him Mr. Scalia, what was the most important event in world history? And my dad thought it was a total softball. There's no way to get this question wrong. Let's see. French Revolution, maybe. Let's see. Columbus discovered America. He goes through all these possibilities. He didn't remember what he ended up saying, but as soon as he said it, he knew it was the wrong answer because the professor was shaking his head and said, "No, Mr. Scalia, it is the incarnation." Yeah. And my father, this is in Georgetown. Of course it's the incarnation. Yes.
Would your father, do you think, have been happy with the selection of Justice Gorsuch?
I have to dance around that one too, but I mean, certainly, he said this in interviews. He didn't want to be replaced by somebody who would help wear down his legacy, what he worked so hard to do. Justice Gorsuch is clearly an originalist and a textualist, and I think my father would be happy with that. I think we need to be wary of assuming that Justice Gorsuch will decide every way my father would have, because people like to think that Justice Thomas and my dad were clones. They weren't. Originalists arrive at different conclusions. So, you know, we can expect that maybe we can conclude later, well, I don't think Scalia would have decided that way. Maybe that's true, but, and I think it's unfair to Gorsuch to assume, but, you know, I personally am happy to see an originalist like him on the court. Yes?
You said that he would speak at colleges frequently, you know, at
Mhm.
commencements, and was dismayed that not a lot of people had read the Federalist Papers. And that seems to hint that he had a little bit of dismay about the direction of legal education.
Yeah,
As somebody
yeah.
who wanted more people to think,
Yeah.
and because that is the talent pool
Yeah.
that is the next generation. What other criticisms do you think he had of law education as it was developing over the course of his career?
He has a speech in this collection about that, and he spoke at William and Mary about it a little bit too, arguing that it was becoming, his concern was that, if I remember correctly, was that it was becoming too abstract and not focusing enough on law as it's actually practiced. I may be wrong about that, but that's how I remember. If you YouTube a Scalia William and Mary Law School, you find a speech about that there. You know, his concern was in large part kind of in keeping with, he spoke at law schools as often as he did in large part because he was afraid and concerned about the direction legal education and jurisprudence was headed. And he wanted, again, he knew that his opinions weren't enough to change those directions, so he had to approach it directly.
Thank you, Christopher. Let's give him a big For those of you who have already purchased that wonderful collection of speeches that's still for sale out on the table, Chris has generously offered to sign books, and he'll do that here. Here right at the
Only
table.
$10 a book.
Yeah. And there are still a couple more books available out at the book table.